The air that morning at Rabaul felt heavy, thick with the scent of fuel and rising heat, as if the island itself were holding its breath. Inside a dim operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai paused over an intelligence report, his one remaining eye scanning a description so absurd it drew a quiet laugh from him. A new American fighter, they claimed massive, overbuilt, almost comically heavy. A machine that looked more like a bomber than a weapon meant for the sky. The Hellcat. Outside the tent flaps, rows of Zero fighters glimmered beneath the early sun, their slender wings and stripped-down frames reflecting a philosophy that had ruled the Pacific for 2 relentless years. Speed, grace, lethality born from lightness. To men like Sakai, the idea that this bulky newcomer could threaten Japan's aerial supremacy was unthinkable, but history often turns in the moments people dismiss. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first F6F Hellcats were rising from American carriers, machines forged not from elegance but from industrial will, waiting to rewrite every rule Japanese pilots believed in. What none of them yet understood was simple. The laughter would not last. Long before the Hellcat appeared over the Pacific, the shape of the air war had already been carved by a single machine. From the winter of 1941 through the harsh campaigns of 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M seemed almost untouchable. It swept across the skies of Hawaii, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and northern Australia with a confidence that bordered on inevitability. Allied pilots, flying Hurricanes, Buffaloes, and early American fighters often entered battle knowing the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange nearly everything sent against it. The mathematics of those early encounters favored Japan so heavily that defeat became expected, not exceptional. The roots of that dominance lay in a design philosophy unlike anything the United States had embraced. Japanese engineers stripped the Zero to its bones, crafting an airframe so light that it almost seemed to float. Armor plates, self-sealing fuel tanks, and surplus wiring, anything that did not contribute directly to performance, was removed. Pilots felt as though they were wearing the aircraft, not flying it. To them, the Zero was an extension of thought, a blade in the sky. It reflected a worldview shaped by discipline, austerity, and a belief that individual mastery could triumph over material weight. Across the ocean, American engineers studied early combat reports with a mixture of frustration and curiosity. When a captured Zero fell into Allied hands in 1942, its tests left them astonished. The agility was extraordinary, the range unprecedented. But beneath that brilliance lay fragility. Thin skin, unprotected fuel tanks, minimal structural reinforcement. A single burst from heavy machine guns could tear it apart. The challenge was clear. America needed a fighter that could strike with overwhelming force, endure punishment, and still return home. Yet when Japanese intelligence first evaluated the Grumman design that would become the F6F Hellcat, their conclusions were dismissive. The aircraft weighed more than twice the Zero's loaded mass. Its fuselage looked swollen, its wings broad and thick, its radial engine a brute rather than a dancer. To commanders accustomed to equating lightness with mastery, the Hellcat appeared slow-witted, almost clumsy. A Zero will fly circles around it, they wrote. On paper, they were right. The Hellcat could not win a turning fight. It violated every principle the Japanese had spent years perfecting. But wars are rarely settled on paper. While the Japanese shore up their airfields from Rabaul to Truk, the United States was preparing something entirely different. An aircraft shaped not by elegance but by necessity, and a doctrine built not on duels but on momentum. Early in the autumn of 1943, the Pacific War's balance began to shift. Carriers approached battle with growing confidence, pilot training intensified, engines improved, and somewhere within the roar of the Pratt & Whitney Double Wasp, a new kind of battle was forming, one that no longer relied on the circular dance of dogfights. The opening moves were set. The assumptions of two nations were about to collide. The first true test came on September 30th, 1943, above the lonely outpost of Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui, escorting a reconnaissance plane, spotted 6 dark shapes lifting through the haze. At first, he mistook them for bombers' large silhouettes, blunt-nosed, nothing like the slender predators he was used to facing. But as the sun caught their wings, he saw the truth. These were fighters, though nothing about them looked like one. Fukui rolled his Zero into a diving turn, confident the heavy newcomer would remain trapped in forward flight, unable to match his maneuver. It was a tactic that had destroyed dozens of Allied aircraft. But this time, the enemy did something no Zero pilot expected. Instead of turning, the Hellcat went vertical straight into the sky, its 2,000 horsepower engine dragging it upward with a force the Zero could not match. Fukui tried to follow. His airspeed bled away. His aircraft trembled, and above him, impossibly, the Hellcat pivoted in a tight hammerhead turn and dropped onto his tail. In 3 seconds, he took 17 hits. Only a desperate spin saved him. 5 days later, at Wake Island, Japanese doctrine shattered again. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros into battle from a position of absolute advantage altitude, sunlight, formation. Yet when his fighters dived, the Hellcats below held formation and accelerated. Their armor soaked up the incoming fire. Their structure stayed firm under pressure that would have snapped a Zero apart. As the Japanese pilots exhausted their ammunition, the Hellcats climbed into thin air. The Zero's engine could no longer breathe. Then they descended like steel-weighted hawks. 8 Zeros fell. No Hellcats were lost. In briefing rooms across the Pacific, the meaning of these encounters became impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Commander Tateo Tanamizu, one of the few veterans who had survived multiple engagements, spoke plainly. Forget everything you know about air combat. The Americans no longer fight our fight. He described a doctrine unfamiliar to Japanese pilots' energy fighting. Speed and altitude became weapons. Engagements became slashing passes, not circling duels. Hellcats worked in pairs, coordinating by radio, attacking with precision one fighter could never achieve alone. We fly as individual warriors, Tanamizu warned. They fight as a machine, and the machine kept evolving. At Truck Lagoon, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida inspected damaged Zeros limping home from battle. The gulf in firepower alone was staggering. 6 Browning, 50 caliber guns threw out a storm of metal 4,500 rounds per minute, each round heavy enough to tear through a Zero's frame. Radar further widened the gap. While Japanese pilots scanned the horizon with unassisted eyes, American fighters were guided from ships that could see them 50 miles away. By late 1943, the skies no longer belonged to agility or tradition. They belonged to altitude, speed, coordination, and a kind of industrial precision the Zero had never been designed to face. The peak of air combat was shifting, and the shift was irreversible. By early 1944, the strength of Japanese naval aviation was no longer measured by victory ratios, but by what had been lost. The pre-war training pipeline, once the most demanding in the world, had collapsed under the weight of attrition. Veteran pilots were gone, consumed in battles they had once dominated. The new replacements arrived with barely 200 hours in the cockpit, many with less than half that. Some trained in gliders. Some had never fired their guns in flight. They were sent into a sky where the margin for error had vanished. The unraveling became undeniable in October 1944 during the Battle of Formosa. Japan believed it had struck a crushing blow. Dozens of American carriers and battleships supposedly sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Pilots returned to cheering crowds and celebratory headlines. But when gun cameras were developed and reconnaissance reports reached headquarters, the truth was stark. American losses were modest. Japanese losses were ruinous. More than 300 aircraft, and the last concentration of truly experienced pilots. One veteran, Lieutenant Sadaki Akamatsu, described the horror with painful clarity. The Hellcats were waiting at every altitude. No matter where we climbed or where we dove, they were there. The real reckoning came months earlier, on June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Navy committed its rebuilt carrier force in the hope of a decisive battle. Against them stood Task Force 5815 carriers and nearly 1,000 aircraft, many of them F6F Hellcats. American radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 150 miles. Controllers vectored Hellcat squadrons into perfect interception paths, stacked by altitude, positioned with the sun behind them. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 12 minutes, 42 Japanese planes fell from the first wave alone. By dusk, more than 300 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American losses, 30. The collapse deepened at Leyte Gulf 4 months later. 7 Hellcats from the USS Essex, led by Commander David McCampbell, intercepted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. In 90 minutes, McCampbell scored 9 victories. His wingman, Roy Rushing, downed 6 more. Not a single Hellcat was lost. It was a moment that captured the total reversal of air superiority, 7 aircraft routing 60. But even statistics fail to capture the human cost. By 1945, pilot training in Japan had withered to 40 or 50 total hours. Kamikaze pilots, boys barely out of school, received as little as a week of instruction. At Okinawa, the desperation reached its peak. Nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties were launched against the American fleet. Hellcats, now veterans of a dozen campaigns, rose again and again to meet them. They intercepted roughly 80%. The rest slipped through in smoke and flame. When the battles quieted and the seas calmed, the consequences were unmistakable. A force once feared across the Pacific had been ground down to fragments, broken not only by superior machines, but by a system that could outbuild, outtrain, and outendure anything Japan could sustain. To the United States, the Hellcats' ascent was more than a technological victory. It was confirmation that a new philosophy of warfare had taken hold. American commanders understood early that the Pacific Air War would not be won by individual brilliance, but by a system capable of sustaining pressure across thousands of miles. The F6F was the embodiment of that idea, a machine engineered not to outdance its opponents, but to survive, strike, and return in numbers too great to ignore. From the American perspective, the transformation was profound. Radar allowed carriers to see threats long before their pilots did. Ground controllers directed fighters with a precision that made interception almost routine. Pilot training emphasized repetition, discipline, and energy tactics, rather than the personal flair celebrated in traditional dogfighting cultures. Where Japan relied on the heroism of a shrinking elite, the United States built an assembly line of competence. Thousands of pilots were trained to the same standard, flying aircraft built to the same tolerances, guided by a doctrine that minimized individual risk while maximizing collective lethality. Globally, observers saw something larger than a single aircraft prevailing over another. They saw the arrival of industrialized air warfare, an approach that fused technology, logistics, training, and doctrine into a single instrument of national power. Even Allied analysts who admired the Zero's beauty and agility admitted privately that such machines belonged to a fading era. The future rested with aircraft like the Hellcat, which turned air superiority into something that could be planned, measured, and reproduced. For Japan, the contrast was devastating. The Zero represented a world in which the individual warrior mattered most. Where mastery of craft could overcome material disadvantage, the Hellcat revealed the limits of that worldview. No amount of personal skill could counter radar coverage stretching 50 miles, hardened armor that shrugged off glancing blows, or production lines capable of delivering a new fighter every hour. The lessons reverberated far beyond the Pacific. Military thinkers from Britain to the Soviet Union studied the Hellcat's record, recognizing that modern war demanded not only courage but systems robust, flexible, and unrelenting. In the end, the American perspective was clear. The Hellcat did not merely defeat an aircraft, it reshaped the doctrine of air power itself. When the war finally ended and the Pacific skies grew quiet, the legacy of the Hellcat was written not just in numbers, but in the silence of those who understood what had been lost. For Japan's surviving pilots, the sight of American F6Fs touching down at Atsugi Airfield in September 1945 carried a weight no statistic could capture. The aircraft they had once laughed at now taxied calmly across their home runway, engines cooling in the afternoon air, symbols of a system that had outlasted every belief they once held sacred. In the years that followed, veterans from both nations spoke with a clarity only time can grant. Saburo Sakai, the celebrated ace who first dismissed the Hellcat as an impossibility, later admitted that the Zero belonged to an earlier world, a world where lightness, instinct, and individual brilliance could decide a battle. The Hellcat belonged to the future. It proved that air power in the industrial age would be governed by endurance, training, coordination, and the ability to protect the lives of those who fought. The aircraft did not simply defeat opponents. It protected its pilots, carried them home, and allowed them to fight again. That, too, was a form of strength. The lessons endure. The Zero showed what mastery of craft could achieve. The Hellcat showed what mastery of systems could overcome. Together, they form a reminder that courage alone cannot outweigh technology, and that nations which fail to adapt to the changing nature of war risk repeating the miscalculations of the past. It is a question that still echoes today. In a world shaped by rapid innovation, are we prepared for the next shift in power? For those watching now, the story of these two aircraft is more than a tale of machines. It is a reflection on leadership, adaptation, and the cost of believing that yesterday's victories will guarantee tomorrow's success. If you value the lessons history leaves behind and the stories of the men who carried them into the sky, consider joining us as we continue exploring the battles, decisions, and moments that shaped our world. The war may be long over, but its history is still being written.